sidebar. It's a little greater than sign, I think, or less than sign.
Okay, well, we won't worry about
But
it.
we're live.
Can we start now?
Yes.
Yes.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our session. I'm Ling Wang. I'm a faculty of color from College of Education at Austin Peay State University. And today, my colleague, Dr. Anthony Sanders, Dr. Monica Gold, and Dr. Shaman Low, and I are going to present our work titled as From K-12 to College, the Social Impact of Poverty on Minority Students. What can teachers of color do?
Okay, just a second.
Okay.
Come on. Oh, got it.
Now, we have more students of color from racial, ethnic minority, or low-income families are attending 2-year and 4-year colleges than ever before. However, statistics have repeatedly shown these students are having underperformance at school and earning fewer degrees than their peers. And more troubling, these patterns are projected to continue in the future, leaving members of these groups behind if no appropriate and effective intervention are provided. Okay, and as we know, attending higher levels of education is increasingly necessary to have a comfortable life in modern society. But our students from disadvantaged background are less likely to attain academic credentials, partially because their families, neighborhoods, and broader social context cannot provide sufficient access to the materials, resources, social capital necessary to compete in academic arenas. Now, my colleague, Dr. Charmin Lau, will take over and share with us what are the structural reasons, social and psychological reasons that caused this situation.
Okay. Hi there. So let's talk about why this is happening. It's very important for us to note that demographically speaking, low-income, CLD, culturally and linguistically diverse students are significantly more likely, as Dr. Wong was saying, than their peers to come from ethnic and racial minority backgrounds, to be non-native speakers of English who were born outside of the United States, to have disabilities, to be single parents with dependent children, to possess a high school equivalency diploma, GED, instead of a traditional high school diploma, and to be financially independent from their parents. They're on their own. And such students face distinct constraints. And the most notable ones, according to the research, have to do with negative peer influence. And often that's coupled with a sustained history of lower levels of academic performance and lower levels of academic and social integration. So they've had negative peer influence, and they're not necessarily being absorbed into those local campus moralizing and socializing institutions, maybe in sororities and honor societies, things like that, yeah? Further, their constraints include academically intrusive off-campus work schedules. These kids, again, because they're financially independent, they're working outside the campus and they have this burden of supporting themselves. They have higher levels, consequently, of accumulated debt load and predictably backgrounds that are rife with limited school resources and poor quality instruction that's staggered, that's from inconsistent professors or teachers, sorry, Freudian slide. And often they have less credentialed teachers with lower expectations. As a matter of fact, in high poverty schools, 1 in 4 courses is instructed by a teacher who's not certified in any area, whereas in low poverty schools, higher SES schools, the ratio is about 1 to 9. So that's very important. Students' social context, the neighborhoods they grew up in, the schools they went to, etc., affect how often their student identity surfaces and how that amorphous blob, how it's suddenly honed and refined and how it comes to define these students. So their identities, whether or not they learn to take advantage of, acquire necessary skill sets, and then learn to take advantage of ambient resources necessary to succeed academically, those networking opportunities of what not only social capital, but forms of cultural capital that they need. That the social capital impacts the acquisition of cultural capital, those credentials that are revered by the broader society. And so students also have difficulty, or they tend to alternatively interpret, make meaning of the inevitable difficulties that rise along the path toward educational attainment. If you're familiar with John Ogbu's distinctions between voluntary and involuntary minorities, kind of something along those lines. So that's something worth mentioning. And so going on to slide number 5, we also need to know that the majority of the students, like I said before, come from disadvantaged backgrounds, and colleges and universities have grown increasingly competitive in terms of access. Meanwhile, the amount of applicants has doubled since the early 1970s. Meanwhile, this is where I meant to stick that cohesive device. The number of available slots has remained relatively stagnant. So we've got twice as many applicants as we did in the early 1970s, about 40 years ago, and relatively the same number of slots for students. So we're talking hyper-competitive environments here. Such students who do successfully manage to manage these selective admissions processes, and proceed to university experience lower and delayed college graduation rates. And that's a problem. And when we think about this, we identify, we talk about graduation rates, we're talking about the acquisition of a bachelor's degree within a 6-year period. And as we said before, peer influence students, and this is the second bullet on number 5, students have a difficult time adapting to the upper middle class culture of academia in many instances. All those tacit forms of ways of knowing and being seem to elude them, and it's very difficult, and there's a lag, and they're disconnected while they're basically catching up during this learning curve period. So gaps are often found in cultural knowledge. Admissions essays from low income and CLD students often show that they don't know as much about those academic areas. The ones, even if they have aptitudes and interests that lie in those areas and they're competent, they simply are being underprepared, or the forms of knowledge, funds of knowledge, to borrow from Louis Small, that they're bringing with them simply are not viable in a traditional university context. And so that's important. And then this is my final slide, number 6. We'll talk about the impact of historic and contemporary social stratification. Let's see here. So we know that, of course, we have long been, and we continue to be, an incredibly segregated nation. Of course, we've made tremendous strides, and there are attempts to erode those. As a matter of fact, affirmative action is now coming under fire, as you know. So low-income and CLD students tend to live in areas that have low densities of college graduates and are low-performing. And living in wealthier places with an increased number, again, that notion of positive peer influence, with a greater number, and of course social capital as well, living in wealthier places with more college graduates does tend to increase the quality of education in elementary and secondary environments, as we know. And that's just to some degree common sense, because as we know, the largest source of public school funding are going to be those local property taxes. And if that reservoir of money is simply not available to draw from, then every other thing that's dependent upon it collapsed. Now, we do know that pre-college interventions have evidenced the ability to not only promote, but to ease students' transitions into university life, and to help relax the constraints I mentioned earlier that impede post-secondary success. Measures which aid this vulnerable demographic often serve multiple academic purposes. So we're getting a lot of mileage out of these interventions, because they're also enabling institutions to substantively address other commitments that pertain to, and other challenges that pertain to diversity. Also, it helps us to hone and refine our own efforts when we're implementing methods and strategies and programs and all these task forces and all these things we have, but methods that effectively increase the persistence of the general campus population. So what we're doing for our CLD students, for our low-income students, not only are pre-college interventions benefiting the students, they help us also to hone and refine our methods to more accurately and aptly target to get students out at least within a 6-year period, as that is the objective measure. And these measures tend to benefit, quite frankly, all students, even those who aren't necessarily similarly positioned. And so sustained pre-college assessments and interventions targeting low-income culturally and linguistic students are paramount to ensuring local and national economic stability, I would argue. We act locally, we think globally, as well as ensuring that our students remain competitive in such marketplaces and in those spheres that they're going to inhabit with these degrees and these arenas that we've guaranteed them access to. And now I'm done.
Okay, so good morning. I think it's my turn, and my slides are what can we do? But before we can talk about what we can do, let's pause for a second and let's talk again about what does that really mean when we talk about students from poverty and the social impact of that poverty on minority students. What can we, our committee, a group of colleagues from higher ed who are all teachers of color, what can we do to help these students? Well, we have to think about when it says they're high poverty students to include CLD students, students with disabilities, and so forth, it means that these students have fewer opportunities. They don't get opportunities to travel, opportunities to experience different foods, opportunities to get books, oftentimes to even read about travel and different experiences. These students are less likely to get selected for programming at their various elementary, middle, or high schools because they don't have the background information needed that makes teachers even consider them because they don't think they have the prerequisite skills to be successful. Fewer opportunities for exposure, and less support at home because for parents, when they are struggling with whether or not to pay the electric bill or to have food, the last thing on their mind is to decide whether or not you need to take that extra workshop training for the ACT or you need to have ballet lessons. So when we look at students who are dealing with all of these things on a daily basis, what are teachers of color to do to help these students be successful? One thing is for teachers of color is to connect early on with teachers, all teachers, but specifically teachers of the majority who are teaching in elementary, middle, and high school. Our impact as college faculty can start in the elementary schools. We can volunteer in those classrooms. We can work as mentors to students in those classrooms, and we can even mentor the teachers in those buildings who are teachers of those students. They need our support as mentors. So being there, being visible, so those students of color can see us walking in the hallways. They can hear people call us Dr. Jane Doe, Dr. John Doe. They can understand that these people bring to their school a different dynamic that makes their school better. So being exposed to these students and students being exposed to us is one way that we can help them early on, even in elementary school, gain the exposure that they need. And oftentimes we just need to listen to what these students say, have conversations with them, talk to them about experiences they've had, things they've seen on television, questions that they may have about things that are going on in our community and in our world, and help them process that so that as they process it, they can begin to see how they fit in the scheme of things. Wow, that if all of these things are going on medically, for example, we can use COVID-19. If things are going on with COVID-19, then you may have a student who has this natural interest in medicine, who now, with all that's going on in our society, is thinking about how they can impact the world by saying, you know what, I think I'd like to become a doctor, or I'd like to become a nurse, or people are having difficulty breathing, so I'd like to become a pulmonologist. I think that's the word I'm saying. But it's important that students look at what's going on the news and what they're reading in the paper or hearing adults talk about, and us helping them process through how they can contribute. So listening to their hopes and dreams and helping them figure out how to get where they ultimately want to get. As they get older in middle school and in high school, of course, making guest presentations in these schools, talking about going to college. I think a lot of students think, especially students from low-income families, think that college is completely unattainable for them. But they're unaware often of financial aid, that's accessible to them. They're unaware of workshops that are accessible to them about taking different standardized tests like the ACT or the SAT. They're often unaware that there are opportunities out there for them to get substantial training that can help them make good scores on these standardized tests, which will at some point help them get even more financial aid to go to school. So once students get older and get into high school, then we can start talking about, as faculty of color, holding orientations to college sessions. And I'm not just talking about the ones that happen in schools all the time. Our students from high poverty families may not have access to that one because it might be on, the school might say, we're going to have a college orientation on Saturday at the school. So if anyone's interested, please come to the school on Saturday. But if you come from a family that's high poverty, you can't get to the school on Saturday. Maybe you don't have transportation. Maybe the bus doesn't run in your community on Saturday. So, as teachers of color, we have to think of ways to go into their communities, go into their churches, go into their synagogues, go into their community centers, and hold these workshops in areas where students might be able to walk to so that they have access to the same type of orientation to college. So, we can talk about workshop training, financial aid, paying for books, where you can multiple ways to get books, not only at the college that you may be attending's bookstore, but there are numerous other venues to include online where students can get their books. We need to talk about academic support for learning, for prerequisite courses, being accessible where students can maybe set up a chat so that outside of these workshops that we might hold, students can chat with us. It's an open chat or something on Instagram. I'm just learning about TikTok. So maybe it's something on Instagram or TikTok where students might have access to, where they can send us comments, and maybe once or twice a week, different faculty can go in and respond to those questions students might have. Having professional development seminars in which guest speakers and professors speak with students in large groups and in small groups. All of those can be very effective. So what else can we do? Support for translating their academic understanding into personal essays. So during the professional development seminars, students can be assigned writing assignments that require them to read articles and journals that their peers grew up reading and their professors assumed that they were familiar with, and then have them sit down and reflect. And that's where we come in, because we can sit down with them and help them unpack those articles and unpack those journals to help them understand more about the world around them. And finally, helping to support them, to motivate and to be persistent. There's nothing like dangling a carrot. I think all of us had somebody say, be motivated. You can do it. Your cousin did it. Your family member did it. You can do. But students of poverty, sometimes they're dealing with, do I just go get this minimum wage job so that I can keep the lights on, or should I even go to college? So being there to support them and encourage them to persist through to fruition is something that we really can play a critical role in. Oftentimes, we just need somebody to say, it's rough right now, but it's going to be better tomorrow. The semester is drawing to a close. They're hiring at this place for part-time jobs over the Christmas holiday. So all of these things are words of encouragement we can offer students one semester at a time. And then we continue to do that. Before you know it, those students are in a position where they're about to graduate. And then they can pay it forward by helping other students who many have come from the same communities that they probably have come from, who are also living in poverty. So I think our impact is far reaching and can be very positive. It just takes time for us to figure out where and when we can fit in, and building those relationships with our teachers, our colleagues in K-12, so that they let us in and that they think of us whenever they have students who are struggling, whether it's academically or because of their low socioeconomic background, that they think of us and pull us into the fold so we can help be a source of support.
Okay, and just picking up from where Dr. Gold left off when we're talking about students who we want to motivate and persist to graduation or persist to the college level. Sometimes students' positions in social hierarchies and the affordances or the drawbacks that they may have come with direct effects, such as economic effects on their life outcomes or indirect effects on psychological processes. One of the things that we talk about with students here on campus is grit. You may have heard of grit, uh, which is sort of guru is Angela Duckworth. But we've learned that we don't want to stereotype that to just minority or students of color. We also have to consider there are other factors that impede on that, such as birth order. A student may have more grit depending on their birth order, or they could have more or less grit depending on the situational experiences that they have. So we definitely don't want to stereotype that with a minority status. That could be inclusive of anyone. But we definitely want to realize that their social positions do influence whether their academic success feels attainable for people like them, or whether strategies such as going to office hours with a professor feels congruent with their identity. And we have to force that sometime, or we have to encourage it, maybe not force it, but we have to encourage our students to, especially when they get to college, to utilize that time with their professors, that time is there for them, that they should actually engage with their professors as opposed to maybe in high school where they try to hide out from the teacher. We don't want them to do that. We want them to actually build academic professional relationships with their professors, as you know, with that being important. Teaching them also that there are difficulties in doing it, but it's worth doing. As Dr. Gold has already alluded to, someone has encouraged you that somebody else did it. You can do it also. We also focus, especially we're getting to the mindset that we have to focus on students with interventions at the middle school level at least. Now, I like what Dr. Gold said about elementary school. I think it's important that we start putting it into their minds that they can go to college and that they should go to college, or at least expand upon their educational studies. But in middle school is where students begin to make those pre-college curriculum choices before they go into the high school. There are certain courses that they need to take. There are certain programs that come out of those courses that they need to become involved with in order to be ready to make that transition into a college program. I do a lot of that with my family, and I also do some of that with my church, getting some of the students to talk with them and make sure that they know what they're doing, what classes they should take. And that's kind of a help to parents because parents may not have that capital to be able to do that. So we want to do that, you know, for our students and just kind of keep building that pipeline so that we can have minority or educators of color or principals of color or school directors of color. We want to increase that. And the only way to increase that is by starting at the lower levels and just encouraging them and promoting them along the way to be able to do that. Students' experiences is very important. Their sense of belonging, whether school to them feels like a useful and worthwhile path, how they interpret those experiences of difficulty, whether they feel affirmed about it or that, you know, that doesn't occur in vacuums. But they are interconnected, you know, socially. So that's very important that we keep them in networks or try to move them to networks that are going to be beneficial in the long run for them to become successful. In groups sometimes, and we just have to keep this in mind because that's just part of the mentoring piece. In groups, sometimes students don't always acclimate to the person that's talking to them, to that adult. But if you catch them one-on-one, they will listen, and many of them will take heed as to what you're saying. So we have to use every method we can to make sure that we build that capital in students that they can do this, and it's very important. Also, to reduce those disparities, that requires considering factors at multiple levels of analysis and potentially intervening at more than one of those levels so that we can maximize that intervention and produce the greatest amount of change. Here on campus, we have some mentoring programs. We know that we need to expand those very much, but again, it's a process, and we are considering expanding upon that. So I don't see any questions in the chat. I will open it up to my colleagues if they want to go back on camera, and we'll entertain any questions. There's a 20-second delay, I believe. But if anyone wants to add anything to what we have said or ask us to consider some other things that we may be able to offer, we'll do that. So we'll open it up at this time. Presenters, do you have any questions or comments additional?
No, I don't have any additional questions, but I do think that this is critical information, and it's something that I urge all of our colleagues in higher ed to really think about, because pouring into these students in elementary and middle and high school is the pipeline that leads to college. And that's where we all are. We're working in higher ed. And if we don't get in there in the trenches in elementary, middle, and high and really cultivate that population and let them know that there are people who look like them in college, maybe then they will aspire to get to college.
Sure. And there are also some programs that some of you may be familiar with in the, at least in the high schools, perhaps in some of the middle schools as well, where they have Future Teachers of America clubs, or they have teacher academies, to try to promote students into going into teaching. That's how we're going to build that pipeline, so that we won't be able to complain that we don't have educators of color. That just won't happen if we build that pipeline so that we can keep them coming to college. Otherwise, we're going to always have that complaint, because that is the pipeline, that is the pathway to both teaching, to principalship, to school directors, all those things that we say that we don't, we may not have enough people of color to supply those positions and to build that for students that may come after them. So I think it's important that students are able to see themselves at all levels of society, but especially in the educational arena, in my opinion.
So do we have any comments in the chat yet? Do we have any attendees? Can we see that? Because I can't on my side.
I can see the attendees. We have several people who are attending. Okay, I have one comment that I'm going to share. I won't use his name, but in South Carolina, there's a teacher cadet program that cultivates high school students to become teachers. So that's an avenue that we can consider.
Is that similar to the Call Me Mr. program?
I'll wait for that person to answer, because I think they're listening.
Oh, okay.
But that's also one avenue, is the Call Me Mr. program, and that, of course, that is a trademarked program. But there are other ways to replicate that program in other institutions. So it's just a matter of, first of all, it's a matter of intentionally using the resources that are available, and that has to come from people a little bit higher up than the faculty. But you have to have that wherewithal to say this is important, and where you spend your time and your resources is extremely important if you're talking about increasing diversity.
And I guess Call Me Mr. and the cadet program start in college. So we really, by our focus being on K-12, we need to look at starting a program similar to that in elementary, middle. I mean, high school has some programs. Future Teacher of America, Future Farmers of America. They have organizations like that. But elementary and middle schools do not. And maybe that's where in the middle school area, we need to plant seeds and start those programs. At least have an assembly once in the fall semester, once in the spring semester, that slowly grows its own into a high school Future Teacher of America organization.
Here's another question. Have you shared this presentation with guidance counselor groups and organizations? I think that's an opportunity as well.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's a great
Because
one.
as we know, the guidance counselors play a large role in guiding students into the financial aid arena, to scholarships and what have you. So yeah, that's excellent. Call Me Mister is only for male students of color, but the South Carolina program included all students. So again, that they have.
Now, I would like to say there have been, even though it's not part of a coordinated interinstitutional effort, there are legislative shifts that are helping. I mean, we all know about the Drive to 55 here in Tennessee, where they're hoping that at least 55% of the adult population will hold some sort of post-secondary credential by 2025. Currently, we're just a hair under 33%. And I know in Kentucky, and I know in other states, for example, students, in order to help bridge that digital divide, students are now required before they leave high school to take at least one online course. And I think that's wonderful. So they're helping to navigate. And I was reading an interesting piece, and it wasn't really academic explicitly in nature, but because of COVID, it's sort of a faint silver lining, but we'll take what we can get. But because of COVID, we're finding for linguistically diverse families that not only is the L1, the home language, being maintained and preserved, but students are acquiring biliteracy and academic bilingual skills, oral skills, and that's very important as well. Translanguaging, for example, is being used with to greater effect. And so before, whereas we couldn't necessarily enlist the aid of parents and caretakers, and we couldn't necessarily effectively reach out to parents who might not be very confident speaking with us because their English isn't so good. We're doing a better job of that now, and we're able to integrate. Also, I'm seeing with my own child's school, and I know this is happening in other places, but when we talk about the efforts of guidance counselors, it's more like we need to do this in a more cohesive, structured manner. But there are, for example, those digital docent tours. So I know that my 15-year-old has toured Yale, most notably, and a couple of other smaller institutions that she has a sincere interest in attending. So that's one way to help keep students integrated. And I think that's awesome because often class markers that might cause people to might cause people to discriminate against students were they to see them in person, don't seem to be as readily apparent in a digital context. And I think that's to some degree an important leveler that we're having.
And I think being able to tour Yale virtually, I would love to do that myself. And I think
I took it with her.
Yeah, I think a lot of students, and that's something that, again, if you're a student in poverty and you don't have internet or a laptop or computer in your home, you're left to doing that either one at school during a period of the day or at the public library. So coming up with ways that we can help students navigate the politics of gaining access to a computer so they can tour schools virtually. And, a colleague of mine was saying the other day that as bad as COVID is, out of COVID are probably going to come some unique opportunities for people to be able to virtually do things today moving forward that they weren't able to do to not even last year.
Yeah, I want to get some more audience participation, just give you some more comments and questions. And I think this one is critical. We've had one participant that said, I suggest training for teachers who are not considered teachers of color to learn how to better help students of color like this presentation. I think that's critical because as it stands, there are not enough educators of color to meet the needs of all of our students of color. So I think it's very important that anybody who has that wherewithal to build the capacity for diverse students to be able to help them and to get them to that college level. I think that's very important.
I agree.
Anybody want to comment on that one? I'll go to another comment. My technology is acting up now. So. All right, that's the best I can do. Okay, that's one. Another one in Chicago. In Chicago, we had Grow Your Own teacher programs that looked to take parents, enroll them in teacher ed programs. One of you might want to speak to that.
Mm-hmm. We have parents, because we have a large non-traditional student population, not only locally, but regionally, we have similar programs. And so we're often offering, of course, online in the evening paraprofessional educators. We have a fast track program here at our institution. So in a year and a half, and it's intense. We've got lots of non-traditional students, which are going to be parents, and they're often people who are volunteering in the local schools, and they're working in a similar capacity. Now they're receiving the formal training. They'll have classrooms of their own. So So yeah, we're doing something quite similar here. I forget, Dr. Gold, do you remember Dr. Brewster spearheading it? It's that the K through 5, which I should know, the K through 5 program, the accelerated program for, and then we have the paraprofessionals programs. So yeah, we're engaged in similar efforts here, and so far they're proving fruitful. I'll have a batch of them during our winter session, and I'll give you more information then. We'll see how it goes.
They are proving fruitful.
Okay. Here's another one. A participant that's a product of the New York State HEOP program, Higher Education Opportunity Program, was wondering if we were familiar with that program, which I'm not in particular, but some of the elements of programs like this could be adapted to our middle and high schools to level the economic resource and the educational mentor support gaps. I think that's very important. That's the HEOP program out of New York, or the SEEK program in New York State. Another comment, question, how effective do you think having summer or preview weeks help in getting students interested in attending college? Dr. Lowe, would you want to talk about our extravaganza that we previously had?
We did have and I used to be the primary coordinator for this FTA extravaganza. Right. So we would work collaboratively, is the word I'm really groping for here. But we would work collaboratively with the local school district, which encompasses, and others. So we're in northern Tennessee. We're about 10 minutes from the Kentucky state line. And so we'd work with Christian County, for example, and with other school districts here. And we would have this huge day where we had about 200, give or take, high school students. And so we would have structured activities for them throughout the day to give them a taste of university life and interaction with university professors. And parents came too, which was incredibly important, because I would field questions like, is it really necessary for me to buy my child a computer and make sure that they're using one for academic purposes? And to that, I would reply heartily yes. And also understanding that we are humans, we are, having a real human connection with someone they thought might have been above them, and interacting with people who are just, that Vygotsky zone of proximal development. It's like where you just push them and nudge them to the area that's just beyond what they're able to accomplish independently. I felt that was happening. So even if they don't necessarily come to our institution, of course, from the universities, from an administrative standpoint, it's an appointment and it's an important recruitment tool, because I'm always sending over spreadsheets and whatnot. But that matters because students are finding that it's accessible. Smaller endeavors include the work that's done by Upward Bound. And I don't know if you guys have heard of them, but they do really good work. And so they'll have students, I've spoken with them. They've been in my classroom. We've talked with other people, and I've, emailed back and forth. We have Middle College here, and I know there are many other institutions that do that. And so Middle College is kind of, it's a university-sponsored secondary school, and these are typically, it's kind of a charter school situation in that I'm not a charter school, a magnet school situation, I'm sorry, and that these are higher performing schools. This is regarded as a public institution, and we work collaboratively with these students to make sure that they are college ready, no matter where they choose to attend. And they often are Clarksville natives too, or recent transplants, because we have a lot of people coming in from Nashville. So we are engaged in those. Those, I think, do help. And even though the digital options are poor substitutions, I think that there's some virtue in those that we hadn't quite anticipated. And so we find that, students are staying a little bit more focused. Markers that might have caused them to be discriminated against, even, not necessarily, of course, by us, but even by their peers, or might have made them kind of feel ashamed and distracted. Those seem to be irrelevant. And when students have to type up questions, for us, that's a concern. They're interacting digitally, and so regional accent and ethnic accents and foreign accents, but if you're a non-native English speaker, tend to not weigh in as heavily and tend not to affect the way they're perceived. So I think those are important measures. Those have been proven effective, although I can't just cite research right now by rote. And those are just, like I said, in terms of what we're doing, those are some local endeavors that have proven quite fruitful. It's really a shame we can't bring more students here.
Okay, have another comment that there's a school that has a partnership with local Project GRAD, G-R-A-D, Project GRAD, which is a well-known national program. So, that's another avenue that we can look. And then another comment in agreement with our comment about not having enough educators of color to help students of color, and what do we need to do to change this dynamic? And again, I would just say that I'll use our minority and males task force that we are actually reinstituting, and Dr. Gold was in charge of that when I first arrived here at Austin P. And along the way, we've kind of let it slide, but we're going to rebuild that. But we had a cross-cultural group of people who were interested in helping students, not students of color, and we were recruiting males and minorities, and we had that cross-cultural piece, and we had several grants that were promoted, and these grants were written by people across that cultural spectrum. It wasn't just minority students or minority faculty or faculty of color. This was across the spectrum. We received several grants to be able to help students to become successful after they arrived here at the university, such as helping them with praxis and, some work study types of things that would help them. We had, I'm trying to think of one thing in particular. We helped with the, the legal thing. They have to do the FBI checks, and we would have students in those educational programs, and they wouldn't have money for the FBI checks, so we would allow them to apply for these grant funds to be able to help them. Our 2100, which is our introductory level course, had a lot of financial obligations attached to it to actually get into the profession. So we had grants written across the spectrum, not just by educators of color. We had grants that would help students to mitigate those expenses.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk also about testing interventions? Because that's something else that tends to disproportionately impact our aspiring teachers of color. And that has to do not, of course, with aptitude, but with background and all those other factors we've discussed. So there are interventions.
Generally, we've come to the conclusion that some standardized tests are biased against, students of color. So we tried to mitigate that by making sure that they had content knowledge as well as just background testing knowledge to help them with that. So we instituted some workshops in combination with our writing center and our achievement center, in addition to just faculty of color and faculty of cross-cultural, just dealing with those issues and having workshops to ensure that our students were ready for those tests. And we saw some insight and inroads into that.
But another reason why doing this so early, even in elementary school, is so important is because in most teacher preparation programs, I believe nationwide, there are background checks because we have to check out the backgrounds of our students before they go into schools. We're finding that a lot of students from low-income communities oftentimes have had encounters with the law, and they have aspirations to become teachers, sometimes because they want teachers better than the teachers they had. And they decide to go into education. And then we find out that misdemeanor they had, being in the wrong place at the wrong time, is going to prevent them from becoming an educator. So letting students know the requirements if they're choosing to go into various careers as early as possible is critical, because we hate to let them get all the way to their second year in college and find out there's a background check. Oh, I didn't pass it. Oh my gosh, now what am I going to do? I've spent 2 years in one program and I've got to switch to another. So getting information to this population as soon as possible, not only going into education, but going into any careers, they need to know things like, are there background checks early on?
Well, Haroon, I don't see any other comments in the chat. There are several comments thanking us for the presentation and providing this information. And if you think of anything else, our email addresses are goldm@apsu.edu, low, LOWEC, @apsu.edu, Wong, WANGL, @apsu.edu, and Sanders, @apsu.edu. I guess I could just type that in the chat. All of them have @apsu at the end. So here we go.
It's our last name and first initial.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Lowe. Know how unsimple I am. Absolutely.
Well, we thank
So
you,
I
Dr.
put those in the
Francis,
chat.
for facilitating and controlling the chat for us and running the share screen. And we thanks to Dr. Lowe, Dr. Wong, and myself. We're all four in different cities right now doing this presentation. And it's been really exciting for us. And we appreciate each of you who are virtually joining us. We appreciate your comments and your input, because we're going to take some of that, all of that back, and see how we can build upon it specifically at our own university. So thank you for joining us this morning.
Arun, is there anything we need to do at this point?
No, you can just stop the broadcast, and that will take them out, and you guys can still continue talking. So,
All right.
yeah. So if you once you stop the broadcast, they
Okay.
won't see you or hear you.
All right. We appreciate your help backstage as well.